When Henry Ivatt was still experimenting with his old 442 Atlantic, number 990 Henry Oakley in 1900, there already was a production class of 442s running on the other side of Britain. Personal friend of Ivatt, John Aspinall, had been hard at work designing his own big express engines for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. Both Aspinall and Ivatt sought their inspiration in American locomotive design, and so both arrived at the 442 wheel arrangement, enormous for British standards. Aspinall's first Atlantic was just shy of being the first express tin-wheeler, but he was beaten by Ivatt's 990 by 6 months, and the first L&Y Atlantic would not appear until 1899. The Class 7, as the Aspinall engine was classified, was an enormous loco. With a more impressive boiler and wheel diameter when compared to the C1s, it enjoyed the nickname of Highflyer. This was due to the boiler being notably high-pitched, and when paired with an inside-bearing trailing axle, it was hoped this would achieve better riding qualities at speed. Critics were quick to point out that the Highflyer was not a true Atlantic though. Whereas Ivatt's 990 was an upgrade over a 422, Aspinall's Class 7 was an enlarged 440. In many aspects, the class had more in common with the Aspinall Class 3, and when you see the pair buffer to buffer, you can see where the critics were coming from. And whereas Ivatt's 990 was built for prolonged power output, the Class 7 was built for speed, much like a 440. But that brings with it a great disadvantage. In order to understand said disadvantage, you have to understand the type of system the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway was. Flanked by the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincoln, as well as the London and North Western railways, it dominated, well, Lancashire and Yorkshire, providing a true coast-to-coast route. The tricky thing is, along the length of England runs a series of mountains known as the Pennines. Now, the one thing trains are universally bad at is climbing. Without any form of gripping mechanism, the total surface area a locomotive has to apply power to the rails has been described as not larger than a coin. In order to circumvent this, when a train needs more grip, you give it extra powered wheels. If speed is not a concern, you make the wheels smaller for more power to be applied quicker per revolution. This concern over locomotives having enough power was once so great that a contest had to be held between the efforts of tailor-made locomotives and a stationary engine which could hold the heavy loads up the inclines in their stead. You would know this contest as the Rainhill Trials. With all of that in mind, let's look at the Class 7 again. Those huge wheels present an obvious problem. Indeed, in order to keep a similar time as the L&YR with their pioneering routes, over which were once held the Rainhill Trials, the Class 7 would have to make the final dash towards the coast with a pitifully short train. And this was especially a waste considering the power output by the Class 7's boiler was nothing short of excellent. But in those final sprints was discovered another of the Highflyer's shortcomings. The high-pitched boiler and the rear inside bearing axle were meant to make the locomotive more stable, but they had the opposite effect. The Highflyer swayed and lurched side to side when running fast, and this was not cured even when replacing the inside bearing with outside bearings. But, for their faults, in 1899 at least, the Highflyers were impressive locomotives. Their boiler, for one, was the largest then in use on a British locomotive, and the entire locomotive was really pushing the limits of Britain's loading gauge, the maximum dimensions to which a train can be run in Britain. Even if the train was very short, the Class 7 could make the dash between Liverpool and Manchester in 40 minutes. They did what was asked of them without fuss, but a driver had to have a steady hand to get one to start, or climb, without slipping. Perhaps their relatively uneventful careers is why they are often overshadowed by the Hughes Class 8 460s. Designed by George Hughes and first delivered to the L&Y in 1908, these 77-ton locomotives were designed for the same coast-to-coast work as the Class 7s, and their association with the ports as well as their enormous size meant they were known as Dreadnoughts. With 4 cylinders, they could pound up the Pennines as the natural evolution of the 462. Or at least, that was the idea. In reality, the Dreadnoughts were mechanically unreliable, and where running was concerned, they couldn't be described as free-running. In the First World War, when the Dreadnoughts were proving particularly poor, the 200-ton trains were mostly in the hands of the Highflyers again. Whilst their original purpose was to hold these trans-Pennine expresses unassisted, these heavy loads had to be worked with a pilot engine, a locomotive which is attached to the front of the locomotive actually hauling the train. Perhaps these efforts were what we ought to remember the Highflyers for. They made the best of, well, a frankly horrific situation. As for the Highfliers themselves, well, they wouldn't last that much longer after the Great War. After amalgamation into the London and North Western Railway in 1922, and then again into the London, Midland and Scottish Railway in 1923, the latter company withdrew the first Highflyer in 1926, and the last one was taken off the books in 1934, by which point the LMS was undergoing somewhat of a revolution where motive power was concerned. A revolution which sought to eliminate the need for route-specific locomotives. The Highfliers were perhaps not the most impactful locomotives ever produced in Britain. Heck, I've heard from plenty of people that they find them ugly. But being a pioneer isn't easy, and sometimes all a pioneer has to do is to throw the gauntlet down.